Morning, everyone. Mr. Blake.
Good morning, sir. This morning we're going to hear from Mrs. Storey.
Yeah.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly, declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Before I start it.
Thank you very much. Can you give your full name, please?
Susannah Jemima Storey.
Ms. Storey, you should have in front of you a witness statement dated the 23rd of May of this year.
Yes.
Yes. Could I ask you to turn to the final substantive page? That's page 102. Can you confirm that that is your signature?
That is my signature.
Thank you. And is that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
It is, although as we discussed, there were some small changes I wanted to make.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we could bring the statement onto screen. That's WITN 00920100.
Can everyone hear? Because I'm actually slightly struggling. Whether it's just me, I don't know. But is the system working properly? Fine. It's just
Sorry,
me, obviously.
Perhaps if you could sit slightly further forward, it may assist.
It's not just you.
Right. Good.
Let me know if is that better?
It is,
okay.
yeah.
Maybe I was a bit too far away
Yeah.
from the microphone. My apologies.
So there are a few changes you'd like to make. Could we start with the first? Which paragraph?
Paragraph 21.
Paragraph 21 is page 10.
Page 10, yeah. In the sentence, I do not recall any significant concerns, which is about halfway down that paragraph. Yeah. 2 lines down, it says, my tenure as director. I would like to insert RMPS before director to make clear that I wasn't a director of the post office at that time. That was a title in my civil service role.
Thank you very much.
The next one is paragraph 110. Page 49. In the first line, I would like to delete single issue.
Thank you.
And then over the page in paragraph 111, I'd like to insert substantial after the only, so that it would read the only substantial item of business.
Thank you very much.
And sorry, lastly, paragraph 201, I realised was missing a word.
That's page 90.
Page 90, yeah. In the final sentence of the paragraph, it says, I obtained significant relating. I think it needs to read, I obtained significant information relating.
Thank you. Subject to those changes, is the statement true to the best of your knowledge?
It is.
Thank you very much. That witness statement will be uploaded onto the inquiry's website in due course. That can come down now. Thank you. Ms. Storey, you're currently Permanent Secretary of the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. Is that correct?
That is correct.
You started life as an investment banker between 1995 and 2006.
That's right.
And relevant for today's purpose, you worked at ShEx between 2006 and 2013, initially on a secondment. Is that
That's correct.
Between March 2011 and March 2012, you were director of ShEx's Royal Mail and Postal Services team.
Yes.
And I think that's the correction you just made to that paragraph. And you were then the first shareholder non-executive of the post office between April 2012 and March 2014. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And that was upon separation from Royal Mail Group.
Yes.
Can you assist us with how you were selected for that role as non-executive director?
So the shareholder executive looked after a number of different government-owned entities, and in some instances there would be a board member from the relevant team. I was most recently, as you were just saying, from March 2011, the director of the Royal Mail and Postal Services team. And once the government decided it wanted to have a shareholder representative on the board of the post office on separation, it was the working assumption, I think, that as the director, that would be me. I've set out in my statement some of the further background in case helpful. So I obviously knew the postal services space well, having worked for a number of years on the Royal Mail side as a civil servant. And I'd also had experience working with boards when I was an investment banker.
Did you have any prior experience of being on a board?
No, I hadn't been on a board before.
Were you provided with any training before you took up the post specific to that role of non-executive director?
No.
I want to ask you about your location and also the support that was provided to you during your time as non-executive director. You became a non-executive director when on maternity leave, which was between March 2012 and March 2013. When you came back, you were based at the Department for Energy and Climate Change. At that time, an entirely separate department. Is that correct?
That's correct. So when, could I give a couple of minutes of context,
Absolutely,
if that's
please do.
okay? So during 2011, the government had a hugely ambitious agenda for these two companies, which included the separation. The Postal Services Act 2011 was passed to enable all of that. We were trying to help stabilise the pension scheme, change the regulation, and so on. And so during the course of that process, as I was just saying, it became clear that we wanted a shareholder representative. I was pregnant during that year, and by the time I started on the board, which was the April board meeting, 2012, I had started my maternity leave, which began on the 14th of March, 2012. When you go on maternity leave, you don't generally know how long you're going to go for, and my expectation at that time was that I would have come back to the shareholder executive, but during the course of the year, I ended up getting a different role at the Department of Energy and Climate Change. So I just want to be clear for the record, I don't think it was envisaged in 2012 that this was exactly how it would play out. In the end, it was how it played out.
Absolutely. And throughout that period, so from really the beginning to the end, you weren't physically present at what we know as ShEx, is that correct?
My last day in the office was the 14th of March 2012, and I was never sitting at desks with those people. I was never in that team again. And as I've said in my statement, I also was required by the department to hand back all of my IT, so my phone and my computer, which is why in a lot of the disclosed documents you'll see me using a personal email address.
Thank you. And the role itself wasn't a paid role or separately paid role in any way, is that correct?
No, I received no remuneration for being the shareholder representative board member, although of course I was getting a salary, and during maternity leave you're paid for some months. And then when I was at the Department of Energy and Climate Change from March 2013, I was being paid a salary by them to do that job. So in a sense, as a civil servant, I was getting remuneration. There was no additional remuneration, nor would I have expected it.
And when you were at the Department for Energy and Climate Change, you were managing an entirely different portfolio.
That's right. I was strategy director there, thinking about the Climate Change Act and all of the things we needed to do to decarbonise the country.
Were those logistical issues discussed with you before you took on the position?
Not particularly. I mean, I think, as I was saying, the sort of set of things we were doing through 2011 to March 2012, I mean, in the course of my career,
I think that's one of the single most complex set of transactions that I've ever done, and I had a career as an investment banker doing transactions. So the critical path to March 2012 was highly complex, and I don't think we were getting into the weeds of my personal logistics at that time.
Not just personal logistics, but in fact actually physical location and relationship with the shareholder executive team, for example.
The relationship with the shareholder executive team we did discuss, because obviously before I joined the board, I was getting up to speed on aspects of the post office with the post office team within the shareholder team. So we absolutely discussed that. Sorry, I had thought you meant physical logistics.
In terms of the role of non-executive director, it has been described by some witnesses as having a dual function. One of those functions being exercising governance over the assets, so the normal non-executive director role, but also communicating the day-to-day government perspective. I think that's how Patrick O'Sullivan has described it. Is that a description that you would agree with?
I didn't particularly think of it as an asset. My view of the non-executive director role is as set out in the Companies Act 2006. As a shareholder representative, I had some additional things I needed to do which the others didn't need to do. That was the way I thought about it.
And was that additional role communicating the day-to-day government perspective, or some other witnesses have said that it involved communicating the post office's perspective to government, so the other way around? Which, if either of those, did you see it as?
My view was that the Secretary of State, in his letter to the chairman in January 2012, had set out very clearly what he thought the objectives for the post office were on separation. I thought it was my role to make sure, on top of the ordinary non-executive director responsibilities, that whenever the appropriate moment arose at the board table, I could help make sure those things were happening. And that was my real priority when I went onto that board, to really focus on areas like the financial stability, the mutualisation, the pension separation, and the sustainability of that company, because, as I think many people have said, at the time that was far from certain.
So you have the government, the letter from the Secretary of State that sets out an annual objective.
The letter to the chairman.
The letter to the chairman.
Yeah.
Outside of pursuing that, did you see your role as in any way involving liaison with the civil service, with ShEx, with government?
Absolutely, yeah. So I saw my role at the board table in the way I've just described it, and perhaps we'll come on to it, but I was always clear which hat I was wearing in terms of being the shareholder representative or the post office non-executive director. But in addition, there'd been quite a complicated history with these companies with the government, and I think there was a strong sense that we wanted a reset at separation. So part of what I was there for was to get in that room and understand what they were actually doing. We'd found it very difficult to get information from them before. And so, as you'll see in my witness statement and from many of the disclosed documents, a lot of the time I was then, before and after board meetings, liaising with the shareholder team to say, well, this is my take on what happened, what's your sense of where things are. So it was a really, really strong two-way dialogue all the way through.
Paragraph 50 of your witness statement, you say, I was also conscious of the fact that my position as a newly appointed shareholder, NED, was a novel one, and there was some uncertainty as to the nature and extent of my remit at the outset. Can you assist us with what you mean by that?
So, as I said, there hadn't been a shareholder non-executive director, shareholder representative on the board of either of these companies. And from April 2012, when they were separated, you had two sister companies, the Royal Mail Group and the Post Office. One had a shareholder representative and one didn't. There was no blueprint for that. These companies had never had a shareholder representative before. So what I was trying to do was kind of get my foot in the door, start this process, but also critically, really critically, build trust with that board of directors. So they were all new, relatively new at the non-executive level. I didn't know any of them. I felt they didn't trust me. So part of what I was doing at that May 2012 board meeting was explaining my role as a shareholder, non-executive director.
So we'll get to the May board meeting, but I'm going to take you back in time. And the first document I'd like to take you is actually a 2010 document, and that is UKGI, I think it's 6062. This is a ministerial submission from Mike Whitehead. It's before your time. Was Mike Whitehead somebody who you worked with?
Yes, absolutely. He was in the shareholder post office team for a long time.
Thank you. And the purpose is set out there. It's a meeting with Alan Bates on Thursday, the 7th of October, at his request, to discuss the justice for sub-postmasters' claims that endemic flaws in the Post Office Horizon system have resulted in a number of sub-postmasters having their contracts wrongly terminated by the Post Office and in many cases prosecuted for false accounting. Were these kinds of concerns matters that you were aware of when you became non-executive director or prior to becoming non-executive director?
So in October 2010, I was in the Royal Mail team and I wasn't doing anything to do with Post Office, so I'm not sure I would have known about this at that time. By the time I became a director in April 2012, I did have a kind of background awareness, I would call it, and I had been, for example, copied in later 2011 on the document in relation to the BBC's Inside Out programme. But I don't recall, if you had asked me in April 2012, what are the top 10 issues on your mind? Unfortunately, I don't think this would have been one of them at the time.
But broadly speaking, you were aware of the issues raised by the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance?
Not in October 2010, I don't recall that, but yes,
by April
broadly speaking. I'm not sure if I would have, at the time, thought of it as Sir Alan Bates and the JFSA per se. I think I would have had a general awareness.
Thank you. Could we turn now to UKGI 3048174? This is a document that's been prepared by UKGI. It's a looking back exercise. And I'm just going to read to you a few passages. The purpose is described there at 1.1. It says, the purpose of this document is to provide a preliminary view of the key facts relating to the involvement of the shareholder executive and UK Government Investments Limited in matters relating to the Post Office's Horizon IT system, and in particular, the events leading to the commencement of the sub-postmasters litigation, which was settled in December 2019. And there's a passage, it's at page 7, that addresses your role. It's paragraph 2.16, page 7. It describes it as follows. It says, in April 2012, the first shareholder non-executive director, Susannah Storey, was appointed to the Post Office Board, and in contrast to the position today, was not on the Audit and Risk or Remuneration Committees. Is that right?
That's incorrect.
Because I think you were actually on the Audit and Risk Committee initially.
I was. I never had seen this document until a couple of weeks ago.
Yes. It then says, unlike the subsequent shareholder non-executives from 2014 onwards, Susannah was by design not part of the shareholder team. Can you assist us with that? Is that correct, that there was an intentional design that you weren't part of the shareholder team?
I'm not sure I would phrase it like that, but I assume it's getting at the point that you were making earlier, that structurally I was separate, initially because I was on maternity leave and then because I was undertaking the role from a different department. And when I went on the board from April 2012, the whole shareholder team was refilled. So my role was backfilled by Roger Lowe, and the team beneath were there. So in a way, I was a kind of bonus person on that board. The team existed as a whole without me. So the essence, I think, of what this is saying, I would agree with. I don't particularly recall it being deliberately designed that way.
So the suggestion here, as we'll read on, is not that it was anything personal to you and your circumstances, but in fact they intentionally wanted somebody who wasn't part of the shareholder team. It continues there. At the time of the appointment in 2012, the shareholder team was in the process of negotiating the funding agreement with the Post Office. And we understand that there was, therefore, resistance from the Post Office to having a member of the shareholder team also sitting on the Post Office board, where the Post Office's approach to these negotiations would be discussed. This meant the shareholder non-executive director, while a representative of ShEx and performing a key role in terms of bringing government experience and perspective to the Post Office board, was purposely detached from the shareholder team. A clear illustration of this being the fact that board papers received by the shareholder non-executive director were not shared with the shareholder team. We'll come on to look at what was and wasn't shared, but it certainly, from this document, and you can assist us whether that's right or wrong, seems to suggest that, in fact, the very role was designed so that it was separate from those people who were, for example, carrying out funding negotiations.
There was a real nervousness on the part of the company and the chair, which I think you're saying we're going to come on to, about having a shareholder non-executive director, and the kind of concern area in particular was the funding, because whilst the government had put in £1.34 billion in 2010 plus the debt agreement, at the time I arrived on the board, the Post Office was trying to agree a new funding agreement with the shareholder. So that certainly is true, that there was concern about that, and the kind of conflict of interest concern was, to my recollection, one of the reasons why I didn't share the board papers. So I think paragraph 2.16 here is broadly correct. Of course, when it concerns you, you often want to make fine detailed changes.
Who did the shareholder team report to within the department?
Within the department, the shareholder team was led at director. So after I'd gone on maternity leave, that was Roger Lowe. He reported into Mark Russell, the Director General, Stephen Lovegrave actually in 2012, and then Mark Russell. And they reported, that role reported into the permanent secretary of the department for what's now the Department for Business. It's had a number of names.
And how about yourself?
I reported into the DG of ShEx, so Stephen Lovegrave and then Mark Russell. What, in terms of this role, obviously when I was at the Energy and Climate Change Department, I had a separate line for my day job.
So you had two lines of reporting?
Absolutely.
Could I take you to paragraph 54 of your witness statement, please? Perhaps we could bring it up onto screen. It's WITN 00920100. It's paragraph 54. Just while we wait for that to come up, did the reporting lines change when Richard Callard took over from you as non-executive director?
Richard Callard was, my recollection is, obviously I wasn't in the team, but my recollection is that Richard replaced Will Gibson, so he would have been reporting into Anthony Odgers, who was then the director of Royal Mail and Postal Services team, then into Mark Russell, because that was later in 2013.
Thank you. Paragraph 54, it says as follows. It says, as I was not part of the shareholder team directly and was not involved in the day-to-day interaction between shareholder team and ministers in this period, I did not routinely take part in the drafting of submissions to ministers on post office-related issues or their sign-off, nor did I assist with the preparation of ministerial statements or answers to parliamentary questions. We will see here a number of ministerial submissions. Am I right in saying that they weren't shared with you?
No, my recollection is I wasn't on the IT system. Had I been on the IT system, I'm sure I would have been CC'd on a lot of things. But because I was separate outside the building, outside the office, I didn't routinely see any of these interactions with ministers, nor was I part of them.
So in your view, it was intended that you would see them, but as it happened, due to the technical issues and your location, etc., it didn't happen? Or
No, I wouldn't put it like that. I think once it was clear that I would be taking this role on maternity leave, then I was in a separate system, as it were, and my role was backfilled. So that was the team in the shareholder executive advising ministers, and I was in a separate swim lane, if we could put it like that.
I want to move on to your initial period as non-executive director. And could we please turn to poll 3046944? This is a letter that you didn't see at the time. Again, this is going back in time to August 2011, but it may assist in matters that we will be shortly turning to. This is one of the letters from Shoosmiths on behalf of Julian Wilson that was sent to the post office. If we scroll down, we can see the way that his claim has been described. About halfway down that large paragraph, it says, however, like other sub-postmasters, he found the Horizon system extremely difficult in operation. He had no effective way of monitoring or correcting transactions that were inputted incorrectly. He observed regular discrepancies in the reports, which he considered were caused by the system itself. He kept records of the discrepancies. He noted a number of occasions when the extent of discrepancies would actually change when the store was closed. It follows on to refer to a concern about remote access. If we scroll over the page, please, we see there that they say that it is denied at C that the post office had grounds to prosecute Mr. Wilson. And it goes on to describe various breaches of obligations. If we scroll over the page, please, the letter explains, over the page again, so there, the Horizon system suffers with inherent defects and or an unfair system of operation, and it goes on to set that out. I'm drawing that to your attention because we'll move on shortly to the way that the Shoosmiths litigation was brought to the attention of the board. Can we turn first to your first board meeting, and that is poll 000215506. Thank you. So your first board meeting was the 18th of April of 2012. We see there that you are listed. At that time, there were only 2 non-executive directors. Is that correct?
That's not correct. There was also Neil McCausland, who'd already joined, but Virginia and I were, in effect, getting appointed at roughly the same time. So by then, you had 3 non-executive directors and a non-executive chairman.
Thank you very much. If we scroll down, we can see there at POLB 12/44, the chairman welcomed Virginia Holmes and yourself to the board. If we scroll over the page, please. To page 4, halfway down page 4. It there notes your appointment, slightly up, sorry. Thank you very much. And then over the page, we can see a number of noting papers. And one of them is the significant litigation report.
Yeah.
Does anything stand out for you in terms of this initial meeting? I mean, it looks from the papers to be relatively brief, quite straightforward. Is that a fair summary, or was it complicated?
Got quite clear memories of this meeting because it was my first one. So we were obviously in the post office offices. It was the first meeting after separation, which was a fairly significant moment in the company's history. In terms of the board itself, no, I think it was orderly. Obviously, I was both trying to contribute but also trying to navigate the environment. I wanted to see how Alice chaired it. I'd never met these other non-executive directors before, wanted to see how the executive performed. So, no, to my recollection, was fairly orderly.
And let's have a look at that significant litigation report. That can be found at UKGI 3018251. This is the first significant litigation report that you will have received. There's a section there for claims over £500,000 or those of a sensitive nature. And it's here that it addresses the Shoosmiths claim. It says, the Post Office has received notification of a total of 5 claims from former sub-postmasters. Each alleges wrongful termination of contract based on A, alleged defects in the Post Office's internal processes, and B, alleged defects with Horizon. Each are seeking damages in the sum of circa £150,000. 4 of the 5 claims remain at the pre-action stage. A 5th has been struck out. And it says Shoosmiths assert that they have consulted on a further 85 cases which are likely to raise similar legal issues. Now, we saw that that was a noting paper. Was there any discussion whatsoever about that at that stage?
I don't recall any discussion of this paper at that meeting, and just if it's helpful to give colour, board papers in those days were hard copy, so we would have a lever arch file with all of them in, and they followed the chronological order of the meeting, and these noting papers were right at the back. We obviously would have read them all before, but to my memory at this meeting, this paper was in amongst some others around health and safety at work, those kinds of issues. I don't recall it being discussed at that meeting, I'm sorry to say.
And having noted that it was at the back, are we to understand that it was quite low down the list of priorities?
I think noting papers by their nature come after the papers that are for discussion.
And being at the back of the noting papers, is there anything we can read into that, or is that just how it occurred?
I mean, I didn't mean it like that per se. I think the chairman and the company secretary would have ordered the papers. I'm simply saying that was how I received it.
Thank you. Could we please turn to poll 3021?
Before we do, Mr. Can you just, is that it, one page, or can I just see the whole document?
Absolutely. If we scroll over the page, there is one other entry that is redacted, and if we scroll over, we can see there's nothing else.
Right, okay, thank you, yeah.
If we turn to poll 3021507, this is a 23rd of May 2012 board meeting. By now, Alistair Marnock is actually named there as present. And I know that you said that the earlier meeting he had already been appointed or...
I was referring to Neil McCausland.
Ah, sorry.
Yeah, who actually joined, I think in Q4 2011, alongside Alice. I think that perhaps you didn't pick him up because he's down as Senior Independent Director, but obviously he's a non-executive director.
But now we have another non-executive director, Alistair Marnock, and if we scroll down, we can see the chairman welcomed Alistair Marnock to the board as non-executive director and the chairman of the Audit, Risk and Compliance Subcommittee. Could we please turn to page 4? And I think this is the section that you referred to earlier about concerns about the role of the ShEx non-executive director. It says there, Susannah's story outlines the reasons for representation of ShEx on the board of the Post Office. She confirmed that ShEx representatives would have exactly the same legal responsibilities as other directors, and like all members of the board, would be acting to promote the success of the Post Office. She clarified that she would not be sharing the board papers with her colleagues in ShEx. Whose decision was that, not to share board papers? Was that yours or somebody else's?
I covered this in my witness statement, and I tried to be as fulsome there as I could recollect. The documents, unfortunately, don't really help me with exactly when this was discussed and how it was decided, but my sort of reflection now, I guess, is that given the nervousness of the chairman about having a shareholder representative at all and about the conflict of interest around the funding review, I would have been mindful of that. And I think I was and again, I'm overlaying this now. I can't recall exactly how it happened, but I think I would have been very keen to ensure that we didn't end up with a sort of two-tier board. So my worry was that because they were so nervous about documents and interfaces with the shareholder, the worst of all worlds for this new April 2012 moment would have been if the board had sort of had two rooms, one where they discussed all the contentious things, and then a very vanilla board that I was in, such that they felt the papers could be shared. So I think it must have been an agreement between Alice and I that I wouldn't share. And I guess I was also mindful of the fact, in practical terms, I wasn't quite sure how I would share those hard copy papers at that time.
Thank you. You've said concerns from the chairman. Was it just Alice Perkins that had a concern about the role of the non-executive director representing ShEx, or were there others?
There are papers noting a meeting between Alice Perkins and Martin Donnelly, who was the permanent secretary at the Department for Business in the autumn of 2011, where she is reported to have set out her concerns. And in those papers, she says that one of the other non-executives wouldn't serve on a board with a shareholder representative. I knew that. I knew that had been reported because there was a bit of a debate with the ministers, and obviously Vince Cable ended up sending his chairman's letter to her in January 2012 to make clear that the government would require a shareholder representative. But I didn't know whether those concerns were more widely held or exactly who held them. I did discuss it with Alice. And actually, going forward in the chronology, even after I'd said this, there was still some serious concern that carried on for a long time. In May 2012, she proposes a separate funding conversation of a subcommittee of the board that I wouldn't be on, and I pushed back on that. In November 2012, she expressed discontent that I was talking to Will Gibson about what was happening at the board meeting. And I note that even when Richard Callard became the shareholder representative in April 2014, the whole shareholder team, I understand, was required to sign non-disclosure agreements to receive those papers. So there was a deep-seated concern from this company about the shareholder and access to information.
You said she, but then you said the company. Was it in particular the chairman, or was it more broadly?
Well, I think the reason I described it like that is because my conversations would have been with the chairman at the time and all the way through on this issue. I don't think it was only her, but if you were to ask me exactly who else, I don't have particular basis to say a list of people. I do know from my work with the Royal Mail before that there was a sort of institutional concern about the shareholder on some matters.
It then says the board discussed possible conflicts. Susannah Storey believed that the areas of possible conflict should be easy to anticipate, funding being a good example. The chairman thanked Susannah Storey for clarifying the role of the director appointed to represent ShEx, and asked members of the board to flag up any concerns either at the time of the meeting or to her separately if they were more comfortable. Could we now turn to the bottom of page 7 and into page 8? I think this is the first mention in the substantive board minutes at the bottom of this page and over to the next of matters relating to the Horizon issues as we know them. And it's a section there under any other business, and it says Paula Venables and the chairman updated the board on the meeting with James Arbuthnot MP and Oliver Letwin MP, taking them through their constituency cases which they believed had challenged the integrity of the Horizon system. The meeting had been a success, and James Arbuthnot had now agreed to facilitate another meeting with the other MPs who also had cases in their constituencies. The business had also agreed to use a forensic accountant to investigate the system and give further comfort to those concerned about these cases. This is under any other business. Was it a matter of discussion, do you recall?
It's obviously very difficult to separate out hindsight and all the documents that I've now read and, all of the awful things that have happened when I look back at this. But I do I do reflect that there was a conversation about this, even though it was under any other business. It was quite unusual for, well, it was only the second board, so, but it was, I guess, interesting that the chairman and Paula were updating us together. So I would have noted it. I think there was a bit of a discussion, but I can't recall all of the ins and outs of what were debated.
And what do you mean by interesting?
Interesting in relation to the chairman and the chief executive?
Yeah.
Well, because mostly papers were presented by executive directors or members of the executive team, and in this instance, it is both the chairman and the chief executive who had met these two MPs and then were proposing the forensic accountant to be brought in to investigate the system.
Is it something that you would have expected a paper to have been produced beforehand, or is it appropriate in your view to for that have been raised under any other business?
Well, clearly now I would have a very strong preference for a whole set of different events on this issue. I think at the time, as my second board meeting, I was still navigating this company and this environment. I don't particularly recall thinking that at that time, but it obviously is, as we all know now, a very significant thing that they were telling us about. So, yes, perhaps not best placed in any other business.
Could we please turn to UKGI, I think it's 6065. This is another ministerial submission, new minister from Mr. Whitehead. And it says as follows: meeting with Alan Bates. So this is another meeting with Mr. Bates, Sir Alan now, at his request to discuss the JFSA's claims. Its members are victims of endemic flaws in Post Office's Horizon system, which over the last 10 years or so have resulted in a number of sub-postmasters having their contracts wrongly terminated by the Post Office, with many also prosecuted for false accounting. And then it lists the attendees. We have Sir Alan Bates. And then we have Izzy Hogg, a partner at Coomber Rich, Basingstoke-based solicitors who have defended a number of sub-postmasters who have been prosecuted by the Post Office in recent years. And this submission details the various background to the meeting. If we scroll down, we can see the penultimate paragraph, a further development of which we have become aware since this meeting was fixed, is that Shoosmiths, the solicitors acting for a number of JFSA ex-sub-postmaster members in current legal action against the Post Office, submitted written evidence to the BIS Select Committee, purportedly in the context of network transformation, but which is wholly focused on Horizon and related contractual and training issues. It then says, following previous lobbying of BIS ministers over an extended period, Alan Bates met with Ed Davey in autumn 2010, and that was the letter that we saw. And it says this was in the context of reports that Channel 4 were planning to run a news item. JFSA has also mounted a substantial lobbying campaign with MPs, several of whom wrote on behalf of constituents. And then if we scroll over to page 7, we have the letter from Sir Alan Bates. Were you aware of these issues at this time being raised within the department in which you were formerly based?
I wouldn't routinely have known about the meeting between whatever meeting Norman Lamb, whatever meetings he was doing, nor particularly about this one, but it is possible it would have come up in my conversations with Will Gibson, either before and after the May meeting. The reason why I say that also is because this submission references, I think, the Select Committee that had happened in May 2012, which was also referenced in those board minutes, because I think the chairman drew to our attention, because Paula Venables had given evidence at that. So I wouldn't routinely have known, but I can't rule out the fact Will would have mentioned this to me.
We discussed earlier the issue of ministerial submissions, and I think it was your evidence that you didn't see them. So you wouldn't have seen this particular document?
No. Sorry, I more meant, would I have been aware that the Minister for Postal Services was meeting Sir Alan Bates? Possibly. I certainly wouldn't have seen this submission.
So you had side conversations with, or meetings with, was it the head of the relevant team in ShEx?
That's right.
Prior to board meetings, regularly, occasionally?
All of the above. So I would have reached out to him before and after board meetings. If there was anything ad hoc that occurred to him or occurred to me that we thought was relevant to the other, we would have absolutely passed it on. We had a very regular dialogue. And in a way, that was the corollary of the fact that I was out of the office. So it was to seek to ensure that what I understood to be happening at the board and what he understood to be going on in the government's mind about Post Office, we could, to the best extent possible, noting the structural obstacles, we could share that information.
Were there any formal channels set up or any formal processes set up for the sharing of information with you?
Do you mean formally from the shareholder team or the government to me?
Exactly, both, either.
No, not formal per se, in the way of saying, right, on a Monday this will happen, but it was regular, the conversations between us. So I didn't feel at the beginning that I wasn't clear about what was going on. I think it's fair to say that over time that did become more difficult, not least because obviously I was less current in terms of the information. And obviously by this stage, the Postal Services Minister was Norman Lamb. Then when it changed to Jo Swinson, I didn't know her and I hadn't worked with her.
Thank you. Could we please turn to poll 3021508? Taking you to another board meeting, this time the 4th of July 2012. We can see that you were present at that meeting. If we turn, please, to page 6, we can see there reference to James Arbuthnot. And it says the chairman updated the board on the meeting taking place on the 4th of July between James Arbuthnot and Second Sight Forensic Accountants. She promised to keep them informed. Do you recall at this board meeting there being any significant discussion of that issue?
I recall this board meeting because it was at the Gatwick Mail Centre, which was unusual. So that was one, we used to try and go to different places to do the board meeting. I don't recall this particularly. I note now, of course, that it was the chairman updating it, us as a board.
And what's the significance of it being from the chairman?
It's the point I was making that if you look through the papers, the way it would normally work would be the chief executive would be telling us. So I would have, I think, been reassured that this was being taken seriously and the chairman herself was engaging in the meetings with Mr. Arbuthnot.
If we turn, please, over the page, we can see that there's another significant litigation report being noted. And we can see again that significant litigation report at poll 3096747. Similar information to that first report, but now updated. I think it says a third-party fraud investigator is to be appointed following consultation with various MPs to review up to 10 cases where Horizon is alleged to have caused the losses. It is anticipated that no further court action will be taken pending the outcome of that investigation. And then there's one other matter noted on that significant litigation report. Am I to take it again that that was simply noted rather than something that was discussed?
That's my recollection, yes.
Could we please turn to poll 0029548? Moving now to August of 2012. This is a meeting between Paula Venables and Will Gibson, who was the ShEx Royal Mail Postal Services team lead. And there's a number of matters being discussed. And over the page, please, the bottom of page 2, there's a section on what's described as Arbuthnot activity. Arrangements have been made with James Arbuthnot's office to refer through cases suggested by MPs for review to him, which would then be sent to Second Sight. It's not yet clear how many cases will be involved, but we believe that it currently remains in single figures, although it may yet grow. Do you recall having any discussions with Mr. Gibson either before or after this meeting?
I don't particularly recall exactly when I would have spoken to him, but as I was saying, I would have spoken to him regularly. If he had meetings with Paula, that might be the sort of thing he would update me on. And this, based on this note of the meeting, it obviously covers a wide range of areas. I'm not quite sure why the Arbuthnot activity, as described here, is under the Select Committee heading, but no. So I don't particularly recall this, but I think it is interesting for me reading this now that Paula was giving presumably fairly regular updates to the shareholder team.
Yes. But there was no formal structure for you, for example, to have a prior meeting with Mr. Gibson before he met with Ms. Venables or afterwards?
No, not necessarily. I mean, the shareholder team would be meeting the post office team all the time, very, very regularly. Sometimes they'd be going to their offices, they'd be meeting on a whole range of things. So that in itself wouldn't have triggered a specific meeting. But the way I tried to manage my time was to meet him before or after boards, or before or after some committee or other meeting I was having with the post office. He would have been in a very regular interaction, I would have thought, with the post office.
And was it always verbal briefings between himself and yourself, or did they produce, for example, packs of information for you, updating you from time to time?
No, I don't remember any packs of information coming from them. I think it would always have been us speaking on the telephone or meeting to discuss. We did have some emails, but often that was logistics, setting up a meeting.
Could we please turn to poll 00103348? Moving on to the 19th of September 2012 board meeting. And could we please turn to page 90? This is a whole pack. This is something that you've addressed in your witness statement. It's the significant litigation report as at September 2012. So this is now separated out between Part A, which is civil claims, and Part B, which is on page 93. Which is criminal cases. Thank you. And it says criminal cases brought by Post Office Limited. First of all, it looks as though these reports are slightly more sophisticated than the earlier ones. Was that your recollection?
They were getting slightly longer and more detailed, yes.
And do you recall any discussion about the reasons for that?
No, I don't recall a discussion. I mean, obviously by September 2012, the forensic accountants had been appointed and were undertaking their work. So my assumption was that was the vehicle through which we would hopefully learn more about this.
Although Part B describes it as principal cases brought by Post Office Limited, I think you've said in your witness statement that you weren't aware that Post Office Limited was itself bringing prosecutions.
That's right. I had a sort of layman's understanding, I suppose. I didn't fully appreciate until the July 2013 conversations exactly what the Post Office was doing. My experience generally is companies do things sometimes with bespoke statutory obligations that enable them to do these kind of things. I didn't have any recollection of this prosecution issue coming up when we were doing the Postal Services 2011 Act work. I didn't recall it particularly being an issue from the separation work, because my team had led a lot of that. So no, at this stage, I didn't read it like that.
And again, am I right to say that this was simply a paper for noting at the board?
Yes.
Yes. Looking at it now, do you think that there was a lack of curiosity at board level when it came to these significant litigation reports? The fact, for example, that they are just noting papers.
Looking at all of this now, and I've tried to be very reflective in my witness statement, I think there's lots of things that could have been done differently. And of course, you know, when you see these words on the page now and you know what happened, absolutely, I wish they'd been the first item on the agenda. And I think when you go through the chronology, once we had the second site interim report, every single board after that, there was a discussion of these issues. But at this time, in the autumn of 2012, unfortunately, that wasn't the case.
If we draw the threads together from all of the documents that we've just been looking at this morning, we started with the Shoosmiths letter of claim relating to Horizon issues, mentioning prosecutions. We then have a significant litigation reports that refer to the Shoosmiths claim, although not in that level of detail, and refer to, for example, 85 potential cases. You then now have a litigation report that, in fact, mentions criminal cases being brought by the Post Office. We have reports of meetings with James Arbuthnot, and we saw a letter to the Minister that referred to the attendance of a solicitor who represented people in Post Office prosecutions. Why do you think it is that nobody at board level was drawing those various dots together?
I think it is, by way of explanation, I think it is important to put yourselves in the shoes of us in April 2012 onwards. So the Shoosmiths letter of the autumn of 2011, presumably that came to somebody in the executive team of the Post Office. The board wasn't constituted then that I was on, we didn't see it. The meeting with Norman Lamb and Sir Alan Bates, the shareholder team would have seen it, but we, the board, didn't see it. And I think the board felt, speaking for myself, I felt that from May 2012, when we knew the second site work was happening, that was the kind of front line of this issue. I think when you look at this issue now, with everything we know, you can see these jigsaw pieces and wonder why you didn't see the picture on the front of the box. But at the time, from what we saw, we'd seen a much smaller set of information than even the documents you're just outlining.
Was it ever suggested to you that you should, for example, meet with Second Sight or meet with James Arbuthnot?
No, unfortunately not. And as I set out in my reflections to my statement, that is one of the things that I regret. Sir Alan Bates and James Arbuthnot were meeting really quite a few MPs. They were meeting our ministers, and they were meeting the chairman and the chief executive. We, the board, didn't meet them. And I guess, as I was saying, because Alice Perkins and Paula Venables were giving us updates, we took some comfort from that.
So I think in your witness statement, you've said that you received an unequivocal message that the executive had complete confidence in the accuracy, integrity, and robustness of the Horizon system. Was that at this stage?
That was really all the way through. I mean, I mentioned in my statement that even attached to the lines around the BBC Inside Out programme in 2011, there was a kind of press notice or public comments from the Post Office, very unequivocal. My recollection of really all the conversations at this stage were robust system, nothing to see here, that kind of sentiment. Yes, absolutely.
And as the person on the board who had a link to the government or a link to the civil service, do you think that at that point in time you should have been probing more on those issues?
I suspect all of the Neds feel whatever the hats they were wearing, and I certainly feel now, on reflection, of course, I wish that we had, from the beginning, done a series of things in a different way. I did expect, and I've now seen documents to illustrate, that the shareholder team from 2010, when Ed Davey was asking, 2011, they were going back and forth to the post office on this issue, and they were continuing to get those unequivocal messages, and they were getting more detail that the post office was saying supported those things.
By March 2013, you had returned full-time to your day job at the Department for Energy and Climate Change, your new role. I think you've described it in your witness statement as a demanding role. Is that fair?
I think anybody finishing maternity leave finds their new jobs reasonably demanding, but yes, it was a demanding job. I was doing a job share, and we were strategy director at that department.
Was it at that time that you stepped back from the Audit and Risk Committee?
Yes, that's my recollection. Yes, so in March 2013.
Looking back at it now, do you think that that was a particularly important committee for somebody with those government links or ShEx links to have been sitting on?
Well, if we go back to that 2012 letter to the chairman, the pensions issue was really very front of mind. So when we separated the company and the government had taken on these huge liabilities, we were worried to ensure that the pension remained sustainable. So I personally was quite worried about that issue because I knew it was in the government's mind. In a general sense, yeah, I think audit and risk is an important board committee.
And did anybody step in to fill that role?
The Audit and Risk Committee was chaired by Alistair Marnock and had other non-executive members and obviously the finance director. Nobody from the shareholder team would have done that, but constitutionally I'm not sure how that could have worked.
Before we move on, could we have that litigation report back on the screen so that I can see the next page?
Absolutely. So it's poll 20103348, page 90. The section with the criminal cases is page 93.
Yeah, just the next page, please. So we've got 4 criminal cases under Part B on that, and then it goes on. That's what I wanted to see. Yeah.
I think that's the final page of...
Yeah. I understand that this paper was for noting. But for the first time, as I understand it, the board is being given information about completed and ongoing criminal cases. Yeah? And just glancing at them, some of them are very significant. Someone has pleaded guilty to stealing over £100,000 on the page we're looking at. 2 brothers are accused of fraudulently obtaining or stealing over £200,000. Forgive me if I'm a little surprised that nobody thought to discuss these things, but that appears to be the case.
Well, I agree with you, and when you look at this page now, absolutely. I can't recall the discussion, but it's actually hard for me to recall.
I'm not for a minute suggesting you should remember the words spoken, but the impression I get from you, so now's your chance to correct it, that because this paper was to be noted, there was literally no discussion of it. And, I'm not hiding it. I'm expressing my surprise that a board, for the first time, confronted with this sort of detail, doesn't discuss it at all.
Yeah, and I agree with you, and I don't recall a discussion. I also don't recall anybody highlighting it to us either, but I totally take your point.
Yeah, sorry, Mr. Blake.
So that might be an appropriate moment to take our first break of the morning.
Very good.
Could we come back at past?
Yeah.
Thank you.
You know, yep. Yes, Mr. Blake.
Sticking with the agenda for the 19th of September 2012, so that's poll 00103348. We see there, for example, item 11 is discussion of the British Postal Museum and Archive funding. Is it odd that something like the Postal Museum might be an item for discussion, but the prosecution that led to, for example, imprisonment for 2 years, sentencing to 20 months, etc., that's outlined in the significant litigation report, wasn't more of a discussion at board level?
Of course. I mean, I think it would be impossible not to take that view now looking at this. At the time, as I think I said in my witness statement, and as is normal with all corporate governance, the agendas, the rhythm of meetings would be set by the chairman, and we as the non-executive directors would follow that.
Did you ever have the opportunity to input into what would be on the agenda?
Not routinely. I think if, for example, I'm assuming if one of the committee chairs, say Alistair Marnock, who chaired the Audit and Risk Committee, or Virginia Holmes, who chaired the Pension Committee, I'm assuming if they felt there was an issue of sufficient materiality, it would, they could put it as an item on a future meeting. And we would look at the forward look, perhaps, for a year ahead, but not. I don't remember shaping the agenda myself.
Moving now to June 2013, could we please turn to poll 00167917? June-July period of 2013 was a particularly busy time in matters relating to the Horizon system. And I think that was also a particularly busy time for you in your ordinary day job, is that correct?
Not June and July, no. In my day job, that actually was only a particular issue in October, November 2013. So this period, it was just ordinary day job.
Thank you. If we scroll down, we can see an email there from Martin Edwards, the Chief of Staff to Paula Vennells, emailing the ShEx team to arrange a meeting for Alwyn and I think either Martin Edwards or possibly Paula Vennells with Will, Mike and Peter, and the topic being the post office / biz meeting on second site investigation. Is that something you would have been updated on by the ShEx team?
I don't recall being updated on this issue on the 28th of June because on the 1st of July, when we did have that board call, that was a surprise to us as a board. The 1st of July was a Monday, so it's possible this was late the previous week and therefore I hadn't had a chance to talk to Will Gibson. And also this is setting up a meeting, isn't it, rather than actually discussing the issue.
And if we please turn to UKGI 401656, we see another email from Mr. Edwards in the middle of that page, please. Emailing again the ShEx team in relation to a James Arbuthnot meeting. We thought it might be helpful for you to see this brief, which we prepared for the meeting with Arbuthnot this morning, to give you a clearer picture of both the facts and the handling issues at play. Obviously, strictly private and confidential, but happy for you to share some or all of it with Joe. I think that's Joe Swinson, the then Minister. If you believe that would be helpful, I'll let you judge. Useful to know ahead of Paula's call with her so she knows what she's cited on. If we scroll over the page, we can see a copy of the briefing. Perhaps we could look at page 4 and 5 quickly. We've looked at this with other witnesses. This is a briefing note on prior to the meeting with now Lord Arbuthnot. And we can see at the bottom of page 4, additional point if needed, depending on the tone of the meeting, it may be appropriate to address head-on James Arbuthnot's apparent annoyance at the issues around prosecutions and the system exceptions. Just pausing there on the word exceptions, were you aware around this time of the use of terminology within the Post Office referring to, for example, bugs as exceptions or anomalies?
No, I wasn't familiar with any of that, and I don't think as a board we'd even particularly focused on this issue of bugs that obviously came out in the Second Sight interim report.
If we scroll down, there's a section there on current prosecutions. If we scroll down, we can see a further entry on historical convictions, and it's there that we've addressed with other witnesses. It says nothing has emerged from the interim findings given to us by Second Sight which would point to specific convictions being unsafe. And then it addresses system exceptions. So we've seen that this briefing has been copied to ShEx. Was that the kind of thing that would be shared with you?
No, and I mean, this particular week, from Monday the 1st of July 2013 onwards, was obviously very intense in a number of layers, but having now seen a lot more of the information, my perspective is that the least informed group at this point were the board. So we had a call on the 1st of July. This is, I think, a briefing for Paula Venables to meet Lord Arbuthnot, which is then being shared with the shareholder team. And the Post Office team are sharing quite a lot of information with the shareholder team that week. We, the board at this stage, hadn't had this, well, we never got this document as far as I know.
Is this an example where it might have been better for you and your role to have been based at the department or within ShEx or within the broader department?
I set out in my statement that one of the reasons when I decided to resign a year early from the board, in part it was because I thought it was actually difficult to do the job of shareholder non-executive director and not be in the team. And I thought it was better that my successor, there was just one line. That individual was in the board and they were completely immersed in the shareholder team, the advice to ministers and all of those things. And this is an example of where the shareholder team knew more than the board.
Thank you. Moving to the Second Sight report, and receipt of the report, can we please turn to poll 001451885. We're now on the 4th of July. Paula Venables does send the board an update, and I'm going to read to you just a few passages from this update. It begins, I wanted to send you a brief email to update you on where we are with the Second Sight investigation. The second paragraph, around halfway through, it says as follows. It says, in line with our discussion on Monday's board call, we understand they have not found any evidence yet of systemic issues with the Horizon system, and it should be noted that this is based on a detailed review of the 4 best cases in terms of compelling evidence. However, as expected, they do intend to draw attention to wider failings in the training and support provided to sub-postmasters, with the implication that this was the root cause of some of the problems related to Horizon. There's reference there to the Monday board call, and also on receipt of this. What was your understanding at this point of the likely finding of the Second Sight report?
My recollection is at this stage on the 4th of July, all I knew was what we'd been told on the 1st of July. We hadn't seen any draft document. We didn't actually see that until the following week. So everything we knew was as reported to us by Paula Venables.
And what was your understanding And we see there, for example, a reference to no evidence yet of systemic issues. Were you aware that the second site report was an interim report, for example?
Yeah, I think we did know that from the Monday night call, although, as I say, we hadn't actually seen the document itself at that point. On the Monday night call, we had been, my recollection is, really quite surprised that this forensic accountant's work that had been going on for over a year was suddenly coming and we hadn't seen it. But in terms of the findings of that interim report, all we knew was these kinds of lines, which were what Paula Vennells was also saying on Monday, no evidence of systemic issues. But I'm assuming on the 3rd of July, the executive also wouldn't have seen the final interim report.
If we look at the next paragraph, around halfway through that paragraph, it says, they shared with us today the introductory sections of the report, which gave some cause for concern in relation to the overall professionalism of the drafting and the widespread use of subjective and at times somewhat emotional statements of opinion rather than more neutral or evidence-based insights. Second Sight had been appointed as independent investigators. Did you have any view at this stage with regard to the way that their report was being described?
No, we could only know what we were being told at that point. They'd been doing this work, there'd obviously been interfaces between them and the company, and on the Monday night, Paula had updated us, and then here she's sending us a further email. We didn't have any other information, and as I'm sure we'll come on to, we were quite irritated.
We see in the next paragraph, we're focusing heavily on our media and stakeholder handling strategy. Were you aware of a particular strategy in respect of the media and stakeholders that was being pursued at that time?
Not particularly in relation to this issue. I would have expected if there was any report, information, action the company was taking that was going to have a public face, somebody in the company would have been thinking about this, but I wouldn't have read this in this email as particularly unusual.
Could we please turn to poll 3099121, and if we start on the second page, please. Moving now to the 6th of July. The board are emailed again by Paula Vennells. A quick further update. She says, I've had 2 further very constructive telephone conversations with Alan Bates of the JFSA, which confirmed his willingness to work collaboratively with us in taking forward our response to the review. Second paragraph, it's worth emphasising that Alan Bates' main issue is not the computer, but the human aspect, how, in his view, Post Office failed to support and help vulnerable and muddle-headed sub-postmasters. Next paragraph, he also raised the idea of setting up a new independent third party that sub-postmasters can approach if they're facing issues with Horizon. If we scroll down, please. It says, Alwyn and I then had a further meeting with James Arbuthnot yesterday afternoon, which was also positive. And if we scroll over the page, please. I'm just going to read to you those final 2 bullet points. It says, one of the main reputational and potentially financial risks arising from the review relates to possible attempts to reopen past prosecutions based on the findings. James Arbuthnot was certainly focused on this. We had a stronger exchange on this point. It's not clear that any new evidence has emerged. If it does, then as I pointed out to James, legal routes to appeal already exist. Susan and the legal team are working with our external lawyers to consider whether there are any implications arising from the report for past cases, and we can provide a further update on this work next week. Now, having looked at all those documents that we saw this morning, in particular the updated version of the significant litigation report, which identified a number of people being sentenced to significant terms of imprisonment, did this paragraph strike you at all?
I think the whole email struck me. So on the Monday night we'd had this board call, which had been difficult, and we were being told about this interim report coming. Then we'd had an update on Thursday. This is now the Saturday morning. There's a whole load of information in here that I think I would have been very uncomfortable about. What? Can I just check? This was the Saturday morning, the 6th, was it? Because I thought I saw at the top the 8th, but was that? It's just a forwarded document, was it?
Yes. Well, we'll go to the
Okay.
the email of the 8th as well. Perhaps let's turn to the first page, and that is the 8th. I don't need to take anybody to it, but we also have a copy of this at poll 00297468. But sticking with this version, we then have an email from Sarah Paddison, so presumably on behalf of Paula Venables, which says, as promised in my previous email, here's a copy of the final draft of the second site report. They took on board the majority of our comments over the weekend, but not all of them. The second attachment is an internal note detailing the remaining aspects of the report, which we believe are misleading or factually inaccurate. Is that something you recall receiving?
Yes, there was a whole series of emails, as I said, through the previous week and then into this week. And obviously the board was very keen to get its hands on the interim report.
Could we please turn to poll 00297469, and this is an attached statement. So this is the media statement that was attached in that, sorry, actually, if we go to the previous email, that's poll 30999121, we see there below that email that I just took you to with the report, there is another email from Paula Venables of the same day, and she attaches a draft media statement.
This is Monday the 8th.
Yes, sorry,
Yeah.
if we turn back to poll 30999121. So we see below that, if we scroll down, we can see that is another email from Paula Venables saying, I'm attaching the latest draft of our media statement, and that's the document that I'm just going to be taking you to. Sticking with this email, though, if we look at the final paragraph, it says about halfway down that final paragraph, the most significant remaining concern relates to his continued determination for us to review past prosecutions in light of the findings of the report. That's a reference to James Arbuthnot not being concerned about those past prosecutions. Did the issue of past prosecutions feature heavily for you on the 8th of July?
As I say, I think on the 8th of July, the first thing I would have done when I received this email was read the second site interim report. So all of the issues I would have wanted to try and understand. And in the email that was sent to us the week before, and also in the call on the 1st of July, my recollection is it felt as if we were being told a series of rather conflicting things. There was this report coming, it was interim, it had factual inaccuracies, the business was trying to correct them. There were no systemic failures, but there were some very serious issues in it. So this issue, they were all, I think they would all have been in my mind at the time. And obviously, as we might come on to, the 16th of July board meeting attempted to get the board to draw together its sense of all of these things and the very, very urgent actions it wanted taken.
If we scroll up to the top email, that's your receipt of the final draft of the second site report. And you said you read that report. Can you recall when you read that report?
I can't recall the time of day, if you mean that. But I would have, and I also can't tell from this redacted document if that email address, for me, it looks like it was my energy and climate change email address. So it would have been coming to me at work. So I might have read it really very quickly, but I can't recall. The other thing that would have been in my mind because there was, as we have briefly discussed, the shareholder team was getting information, and as we now know, the next day the minister ended up giving a statement in the House. So I would have been very keen to understand what was going on with Will Gibson, Roger Lowe and that team in relation to the minister.
So as at the 8th of July, you would have read the second sight report?
I can't think why I wouldn't have. As I say, it is difficult 12 years ago or whatever it is, 11 years ago, to say the time of day when I would have read it.
I'd just like to take you to the attachments to those emails. If we could first look at poll 002974669. This is the media statement that was attached to the second email on that page. And about halfway down, it says there, the Post Office is committed to supporting its people and improving the way we do so. The interim review makes clear that the Horizon computer system and its supporting processes function effectively across our network. As the review notes, it is used by around 68,000 people in more than 11,500 branches, successfully processing more than 6 million transactions every day. The review underlines our cause for confidence in the overall system. It does, however, raise questions about the training and support we've offered to some sub-postmasters, and we are determined to address these issues. Having read the second sight report, do you consider that to have been an accurate reflection of the report?
I don't know at the time on that Monday how much I would have been looking at this press statement. I think I would have been more likely to be reading the second sight interim report to try and understand what it was saying. And I do have a memory of being concerned by what it was saying, and in particular thinking about this point on training and support and helplines. So I don't think I would have particularly been thinking, does this draft press notice exactly accurately reflect what was in the report on that day?
But having read the ultimate press reports in the press itself, did you have a view as to whether the Post Office was being accurate in its summary of the second sight report?
I can't recall particularly thinking about the Post Office's press reports at the time. I think the lines we see here are reasonably consistent with what we had often heard from the Post Office, and then even after the interim report, what we continued to hear around, the sort of, and I'm summarising, but broadly the system working, and then there being questions and issues around training and support.
Could we turn to poll 002974770? This is another attachment. This is the Post Office Horizon question and answers. Would you have read this attachment at the time? Sorry, it's not on screen yet. That's... Do you recall this document?
Well, I've seen now it was attached to an email. I don't particularly recall this, and I'm not sure at the time that I would have been most focused on Q&A and press releases. I would have been much more likely to be worrying about how the board had been blindsided and what this report said and what we were going to do about it and what was the minister going to say.
I'm just going to read you a few passages from this document. The second paragraph says, we cannot comment on any individual cases, but of course all cases were fully tested in court and no evidence found to suggest the Horizon system is at fault. Another question posed is, are you saying you're going to review all cases? And it says, the review has raised some concerns regarding our training and support processes. Of course, it is only right that a review should be undertaken of any cases where we feel the finding of this interim review might have any bearing. If we scroll down, there's a question I've heard. There is evidence of faults in the system. And it says, as the review stresses, the Horizon system has around 68,000 users and processes, more than 6 million transactions every day. while we take every case very seriously, the total number of cases accepted by the external reviewers for this review was 47, less than 0.1% of the total number of users of the Horizon system. With a system of this scale, it's of course, there may be exceptions, whether this is as a result of a power cut or through operator error. We have systems in place to identify and rectify these as quickly as possible, check against findings in report, and then whenever reconciliation issues arise in the system, we contact branches to inform them that reconciliation is required, either by post office or branch. If we scroll over the page, there's a section there, why have you destroyed documents relating to criminal investigations? And it says, in line with industry standards, we operate a 7-year document retention policy. If we keep on turning over the page, please, to page 7, penultimate page. So thank you very much. Why are you able to run your own prosecutions? This can't be fair. It says, as with HMRC and other bodies with safeguarding public money, need to check the accuracy of this. The Post Office has investigation and prosecuting authorities in its own right. And then there's a question, will you reconsider investigating and prosecuting cases yourself instead of handling these functions to the Police and Crown Prosecution Service? I know you've said that you don't recall paying much attention to these particular attachments rather than the report itself, but were you at this time aware of public lines being taken by the Post Office that were different to what you had read in the report?
I don't think I would have been on that day, Monday, the 8th of July, and I don't recall particularly seeing this Q&A document. This looks like a draft, but I'm assuming there was a final one that was similar. So
this was the attachment to
that email.
The second email on that page, sent to you by Sarah Paddison on behalf of Paula Venables.
I think I obviously appreciate why you're asking it the way you're asking, but if you put yourself in the shoes of an individual who has been, as a board member, waiting for this report, slightly surprised it's coming in a rush, getting conflicting messages, I think the thing that would have been on my mind would have been, what is in this report and what are we going to do about it? I just don't think I would have been comparing public lines and Q&A at that point.
Do you recall at that point having any discussions with anybody at ShEx about the report?
I can't, in my memory, recall the to and fro with ShEx, but I know that I would have because this was such a significant issue. On my time on the board, I think I'm right that the Minister only gave 2 oral statements, and one ended up being on Tuesday, the 9th of July 2013. So that would have been a significant thing for them. And as I've now been able to see, there was a lot of to and fro between them and the Post Office, getting ready to brief Jo Swinson, and she also has been to this inquiry.
And do you think that there was insufficient sharing of information from the ShEx team to yourself on issues relating to the second site report?
I mean, I haven't thought about it. I didn't think about it like that at the time. Now I've seen all of the to and fro. I think one of my observations would be that what was so unusual about this issue was that the Chairman and Chief Executive were having the interface with Sir Alan Bates and the JFSA and James Arbuthnot. MPs were raising things with ministers through parliamentary questions, correspondence. There was a to and fro between the Post Office and the shareholder. And I think in this week, it seems to me now, with everything I've seen, the board were the least informed of all.
And as the government representative on the board, was there a problem there in the communication from those who were working on behalf of the government?
I wouldn't put it like that, but and I don't think there was a problem. I've described the way in which we worked during this period, I think we would have been very regularly discussing. I think, of course, now when you look back, everybody would have wished, and I certainly wished, I had a whole load more information at a number of points, and this one included.
But was it lines of communication? Was it individual personalities? What was it that interrupted the flow of information relating to the second site report?
I don't think I did say that the flow was interrupted. It was more that there were a set of events playing out very fast in real time, and so I imagine the shareholder team's priority, rightly, was to brief the minister. My priority was to get the information as a board member, and we would have been communicating between us.
Let's turn to the board meeting. Could we please look at poll 30021516? And that's the 16th of July 2013 board meeting. It's a meeting that the inquiry has looked at on a number of occasions. We note there, in terms of those who are present, that Susan Crichton was not present. Did you understand why Susan Crichton wasn't present?
No. A lot of the issues around that have been brought out in this inquiry, I was not aware of on that day.
Did you attend a pre-meeting to the board meeting in a restaurant?
There was a breakfast that morning. In fact, when I wrote my statement, I couldn't identify if it definitely was that morning, but I think now it was that morning. And that, my recollection was with the chairman and those non-executive directors who were there. Neil McCausland had given apologies that day. But yeah, I do have a recollection of a conversation of just the non-executives and the chairman, with a lot of discontent being expressed about the way this set of events had unfolded.
And was that directed at a particular individual?
My own view was the executive had mishandled the interface between the board and the whole of this second site interim report, and I held Paula Vennells responsible for that as the chief executive.
That was your own view. What were the views of others as expressed at that breakfast meeting?
Again, I can't recall the ins and outs of all of the conversation, but I think there was a kind of, my recollection is there was a sort of groundswell of discontent.
Aimed simply at the executive team or at others?
When you're a non-executive director, your role really is to provide oversight, but the executive team, and in particular the executive directors, are the engine room of the business. They're the people who are responsible for running that business, for undertaking with appropriate care and diligence all of their tasks. And I think we felt frustrated that after over a year of work, there was suddenly this very rushed week. The report had been published, and I would have felt that the minister had been put in a difficult position, having to make a statement to Parliament.
And were there any individuals specifically named during those discussions that stand out?
I don't recall that. I think this was part of where some of my concerns about the chief executive were starting to crystallise.
And what were those concerns?
It's really hard to talk about somebody's performance in this context now, with everybody reflecting with such a spotlight. And in my experience of executive teams, performance can change. People can be stronger and weaker on different things. I think I felt, though, that this particular issue hadn't been well handled by the executive team. And despite the rush of communications, some late night emails, some weekend emails, it just didn't feel orderly. And as a non-executive director, the things that you take comfort from are that the organisation is orderly, thoughtful, no surprises. No surprises is a really big thing. I still think of that and use it a lot today with, you know, I have 42 arm's length bodies in the department I'm responsible for. You do not want to be surprised. And I think at that time, I felt that it hadn't been well handled, and I think that comes out in the minutes for the subsequent board that day, where we went on to say we didn't want to be blindsided and a whole load of actions were put in train.
We mentioned just before the absence of Susan Crichton. That was explained by Alice Perkins in her evidence, if I am to summarise, that events overtook her, and I think it was along the lines of the thought didn't come into her head to invite her back in. Were you even aware of Susan Crichton sitting outside that meeting?
I don't recall anything to do with her sitting outside, obviously because some of the papers we looked at that day, there was a paper from Susan written on the 12th of July, it was from her. I suppose I might have thought, why is this being presented by Paula Venables? But I don't remember now a big focus on that. And I suppose I also would have thought that if the General Counsel wanted or thought she should be in the room, she would have been in the room. It wouldn't really have occurred to me that somebody would stay outside a room. And
was the atmosphere in the room such that matters were happening very quickly? It was a particularly rushed or particularly packed board meeting, or not? I don't recall that. I mean, as you know, the board agendas for this company through these years, when I was a non-executive director, were hugely full because there was so much business to be done on very difficult and important issues. I don't particularly recall this one being more or less packed than any other. Thank you. If we go through a few passages from the minutes, we see at the bottom of this page, the board discussed the papers received from the executive committee members and agreed that in future the content of the papers would not be presented at the board meeting so as to free up time for discussion. The papers needed to be clear, not overly optimistic and commercially focused, so questions of fact would not be necessary. They should also arrive in good time. The chairman asked the board to contact the EXCO member responsible for a paper before the meeting if they were unclear or didn't have the necessary detail. The board also asked for earlier warning when risks and issues arise to ensure they were not blindsided. Can you assist us with that passage, please? Well, I think we had been blindsided the week before, and we were irritated. And my reflection is, in any situation, in any company, or if something starts to go wrong, those are the times that you want to get into more detail. I think we felt that we'd been bounced by the second site interim report. And so I think that's why we were saying, please give us early warning of risks. Please tell us about risks. Please do not blindside us. The minutes, as you know, are quite mild in their phrasing, quite anodyne. A word like blindsided, I think, was probably a direct quote. If we could turn to page 6, there's the section on the Horizon update. I won't spend much time on it because this is something we've seen a lot of, but at B it says the board were concerned that the review opened the business up to claims of wrongful prosecution. The board asked if Susan Crichton as General Counsel was in any way implicated in the prosecutions. C, the board expressed strong views that the business had not managed the second site review well and stressed the need for better management and cost control going forward. There's a reference there to the business. Can you recall specific names being mentioned? I don't recall particular names, but at the time, you know, I think the day-to-day interface would have been between Paula Venables, and as we've discussed, she gave a number of the updates, and also Susan Crichton. The board accepted that this was an independent review and therefore things could happen beyond the control of the business. However, the things that could be managed by the business needed to be well managed with strong leadership, and the board asked the CEO if she had considered changing the person leading for the business. What did that mean?
I think there was this sense, and it's quite hard to disaggregate now specifically which meeting different considerations came up and were then discussed and acted on, but there had been a sense increasingly, I think, that the second site interim report and second site, they were independent. The board itself hadn't had particular control of the terms of reference. If you remember back to the May meeting, we were just told in AOB that this was happening and we thought it was a good thing to do. But I'm assuming there was a sense at the time that we wanted, because now we'd seen the report, there were a whole load of actions being discussed to be taken forward, we wanted a kind of programme of work with clear leadership. And if you're a board, a non-executive director, what you want is to be confident that there'll be people leading that who've got the capacity and capability to do it, and will get whatever the work is done.
If we scroll over the page, please, there's one final passage that I'd like to take you to, and that's the CFO was asked what the insurance position was. He promised the board a note on this. He was also asked to ensure that both Royal Mail Group and business insurers were given notice of the review findings. Do you recall the insurance position being raised at that meeting?
I have a sort of vague recollection. I can't recall who it was. It may have been Alistair Marnock in his position as audit committee chair, because often in businesses, if a risk profile changes, regardless of whether or not it manifests, you need to notify the insurers. So it may have been that. The other thing is that as part of the separation of the two businesses, the Royal Mail Group, I think, had been the named party on some of the insurance contracts. So, and we were trying to finish the transitional services such that the post office stood on its own, so it could have related to that. But I can't, I've sort of wondered about this and I can't really recall much more.
Okay, I'll take you to some of the insurance-related emails shortly. If that could come down, please. Paragraph 127 of your witness statement, you say that this was the first time that you became aware that the post office was able to act and was acting as a prosecuting authority. And you've described your feeling as being uncomfortable by that. What did you mean by uncomfortable?
I think, as I said earlier, I'd obviously seen the SLRs which had talked about legal situations. I don't recall it having occurred to me before I read the papers for this 16th of July board meeting that specifically what the post office itself was doing, and that made me feel uncomfortable. I was surprised by it.
Did it suggest something quite fundamentally wrong with the levels of information that was going to the board?
I don't think I was necessarily thinking that, because as a non-executive board member, consistent with governance codes and best practice, you do not expect to see the vast majority of information. What you expect is that the responsibilities are clearly defined, the delegations are working, you've got first and second line assurance to sort of double check. So I don't think I would have been thinking particularly that point. I just had a discomfort because a year into the business and having seen the second site interim report, it made me feel uncomfortable.
Could we turn back to your witness statement, please, on page 100? It's page 100, paragraph 218. If we scroll down, you say in paragraph 218, I do continue to think we were robust in our scrutiny and challenged the executive team when we had the information to enable us to do so. And while there were numerous proactive steps that I have detailed in this document, my view now is that it's impossible now not to feel now that more should have been done, even if the signs at the time did not point us to that place, given the assurances we were being given. Looking at this moment in time where you find out that the post office itself prosecutes people, do you think that you were sufficiently robust in scrutinising?
Would you mind if I just make a general comment about us as a board before I come on to that point?
Absolutely.
When I went on to the board in April 2012, I was pleasantly surprised by the calibre, to my mind, of those non-executive directors. They were extremely robust, to the point that sometimes I used to feel in meetings that it must have been quite difficult for the executive members or people presenting. People did not hold back in saying what they thought, what they were worried about, and in challenging. So as a general sense, I did think we were robust in our scrutiny, and not for this inquiry, but as you know, there was an array of things that we were trying to do with that business, most of which were not easy. I think the point here is, and I wanted to reflect at length in my statement, because the situation has just been so catastrophic. You can't help feeling, as a person, I was responsible between April 2012 and March 2014 as the shareholder non-executive director. You can't help feeling that we should have done more. So yes, now I think on each of these areas, could we, should we, what would have happened if we had done more? I mean, I set out in paragraph 140 of my witness statement all of the actions we did take, and I think at the time we thought we were being active and prudent. That's how it felt. It was a very busy time after the interim report. A whole load of things happened. It's a reflection, though, that, of course, you wonder if you could have, should have done more.
And given the terms that we used at that board meeting, blindsided, etc., do you think that you took sufficient steps at board level to scrutinise the whole way that the company was being run at that stage?
Yes, I mean, I think generally we had been and were at that stage and continued to be for the period that I was on the board diligent in trying to ensure that the company was running with an appropriate control environment and in an appropriate way. In relation to this issue, after and at that 16th board meeting and in the following 16th of July board meeting and in the following weeks and months, there were a range of things that happened, and yeah, at the time that did feel very active. As I have also put in my reflections, you know, whilst we had actions in terms of the mediation scheme, the various pieces of work and the follow-on with Second Sight, and later set up the board committee specifically on this, I do reflect now that we should have done more at that point and onwards on past prosecutions.
Thank you. So that might be an appropriate moment to take our second morning break. Thank
Yep.
you. If we could come back just after 1:15. Storey, I said that we would address the issue of insurance and insurance notification, and that's the issue that I'd like to address now. Could we please start by looking at poll 3099330? So we've had the board meeting of the 16th of July, and there was that slightly ambiguous wording in the minutes that we looked at relating to the insurance position. This is an email from Alwyn Lyons to the board, including yourself. We can see there. Thank you very much. And that Alwyn Lyon says, on Tuesday, the board asked for information on 3 things this week. First, a paper on transitional support services. Second, the impact of the financial services junction insurance changes. And then third, the impact on Horizon/Second Sight on our insurance cover. And then there is a section, paragraph at the bottom. It says insurance. We discussed what impact the current Horizon issues might have on our insurance, on which we are advised by our insurance broker, Miller. Their view is that whilst other insurance policies may be impacted, the most likely one is directors and officers. This has the added complication, as it is the only policy we share with Royal Mail and was placed by their broker, JLT. The excess on this policy varies under different criteria, but the main one is £25,000 on each and every claim. A meeting is being set up with JLT and Miller to ensure they're fully briefed on the issues before JLT engage with the insurer. Moving on to poll 3099331. Do you recall receiving that email?
The email that you've just been reading from?
Yes.
Yes, I would have. I think, as it says, we had asked for things obviously very quickly, so that was coming 3 days after the board meeting.
Thank you. If we please turn to page 3, bottom of page 2, actually, and the top of page 3. We see, if we scroll down slightly, Alistair Marnock responding to Chris Day, whose name was at the bottom of that previous email. Slightly further down, sorry. Thank you very much. And he says, on the insurance question, we were keen to know if we have currently got insurance cover for any claim arising. Don't think your answer deals with this point. I'm sure Susan will know, though. You're not on this email chain. I'm just going to go through it just to provide some background and some context. If we scroll up, it seems as though this is an email from Mr. Marnock to Paula Venables, and he says, no need to broadcast loudly, but I don't think I think that's Chris Day, has understood the question on insurance, or I've misunderstood the answer. Either way, a click clarification will hopefully avoid more mails. And if we scroll up, Mr. Day responds internally, and he says, sorry if not clear, there are 2 points. Firstly, D&O appears to be the policy which would cover this eventuality, and our understanding is the first 25,000 of any claim is not covered. This is being verified. Secondly, our broker, Miller, will meet with Royal Mail's JLT to determine the best way to engage with D&O insurer or insurers, which will enable us to understand the possible impact on this and possibly other policy premia going forward. The subtlety here is that we need to inform existing insurers of a potential new risk in hand without scaring the horses into immediately increasing future costs. And this process is made more complex by being a joint policy with Royal Mail, the only one that is configured that way. We'll provide a fuller update when we've established all the facts next week. Charles, please confirm my understanding is correct. If we scroll up, there is then an email from Paula Venables forwarding that response to Alistair Marnock. And she says, hi, Alistair, did you get the clarification you asked for? I also left a message with Chris, as his note on insurance cover raised 2 questions for me. Firstly, that there could be an impact regarding future costs across several policies. I understand D&O, but which others may be obvious to the experts, but isn't to me. And secondly, his note seemed to imply we were going to check if we are covered. Does that mean we may not be, or we don't know? Chris's reply to me on my 2 questions is below. The line which bothers me slightly is D&O appears to be the policy which would cover. Am I being too hawkish? I would have preferred to read D&O is the policy which, if needed, would cover. Does Chris's reply to you give more comfort? I don't want to pile the pressure on Chris by going again unnecessarily. If we scroll up to the top, we have the response from Mr. Marnock. He says that he's afraid Chris's answer doesn't address the key question as to whether or not the Post Office have got cover. He dropped me a note which suggested we do, but it seems to suggest it would be under D&O cover. Like you, I'm concerned that we believe this policy would cover us for this sort of issue. Rather, I'm sure we will have a PI policy which will cover us for this and any other like issue. The follow-on issue is that to avoid the underwriters rejecting our claim, we need to keep them abreast of developments and any possible claims on this and any other issues. Experience tells me that keeping underwriters updated on this sort of developing issue can be very tricky, getting the balance right in levels of disclosure. Normally, I would have expected Chris to have been involved in discussions with Susan, testing the thinking at each stage of the process. I've gone back to Chris for further clarification, but I suggest it's handled in a face-to-face conversation. The issues about any disclosure is that it will affect our premiums even if the underwriters don't pay out. It's a bit like having to report near misses when you're driving as well as crashes. The result will be higher premiums, etc., but turn the issue, hassle/cost on its head, and we can reverse this problem into a cost-saving process/improvement opportunity by combining necessary reporting to underwriters with improvements on our own process, identifying mistakes and tracking mechanisms to their resolution. I'm afraid I'm going through the chain of events, so I am going to have to read a fair amount from this chain. Almost a week goes by after that, and then the board is provided with an update on the work programme arising from the Horizon report. That can be found at POL 00298-004. There were two versions of this report that were sent to board members. Do you recall, in broad terms, this document?
I do recall it in broad terms.
The document says, further to the board discussion on the 16th of July, this note provides an update on how we're taking forward the programme of work. So this is essentially how we are taking forward the matters raised at that board meeting. And we see, if we scroll down, there's a section on completing the second site reviews over the page. And onto page 3, the bottom of page 3. We see there's prosecution case review, and it outlines that through our criminal law solicitors, Cartwright King, we're complying with this duty by reviewing past and present prosecutions to identify any cases where the second site report ought to be disclosed. Scrolling over the page to paragraph 17, there's reference there to Brian Altman's review. Can we go to paragraph 30 on page 7, please? Paragraph 30 says, the board requested further information on the insurance position. A separate note is attached on this. Annex A also provides further information at directors' duties as they relate to this review. And I'm going to just now take you to the covering email to that. That can be found at POL 001458882. And if we start on page 3, the bottom of page 3, we see Alwyn Lyon's emails, and we'll scroll up in a bit to see the group, but you are one of the recipients. Dear all, please find attached a detailed note from Paula providing an update on the programme of work in response to the Horizon investigation. That is then, if we scroll up, we can see copied to you a response from Alistair Marnock saying at the bottom of that email, he says, finally, I seem to be missing the insurance update. Could you please resend? And that's a reference to the insurance update that's promised at page 30 of that document that I have just taken you to. If we keep on scrolling up, please. Martin Edwards then responds and says, apologies all. It should have been this version of the note attached to yesterday's email, which incorporates the insurance information at paragraph 31, rather than leave that in a standalone note. And I'm going to take you to that updated version very shortly. But before I do that, if we could just have a look at the email from Alice Perkins. She emails, again, the board, including yourself. She says, I had some thoughts which I want to put on record about the way ahead. First, while it's clear that we're committed to using Second Sight for the 47 cases which are already in the frame for their review, it's extremely important that we cap their involvement at that. This is a separate issue, but I'd just like to pause there and just ask you about that. Do you recall a movement towards capping Second Sight's involvement at that stage?
I mean, I can obviously read the words on this page. I don't recall thinking of it in that way at that time. I thought that after the 16th of July board meeting, there were a whole load of actions, and that included work for Second Sight.
Because it follows in the next sentence, the moment they're involved in additional cases beyond these, we will have lost the ability to end the relationship with them. Were you aware of a desire to end the relationship with Second Sight at that stage?
I mean, this and all the other things you have just shown me are a series of emails that were coming in after the board meeting. I would have read these words, noted that they're from the chair. I don't particularly remember that issue to a greater extent than any of the others at this point.
But it being, I think, on your own evidence, quite a significant board meeting of all the board meetings that we've seen, would you have paid quite a lot of care and attention to the emails you were receiving at that stage?
You mean the 16th of July?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that even in the ones you were just showing, I'm sure we'll come back to the insurance question, but you can see emails coming out on the 19th of July, which is after we would even have received the minutes, then emails to and fro, some of which I was not copied on through the weekend. But yeah, there was a whole series of actions, and I would have been very focused on it because, going back to our conversation earlier, I was irritated about the handling.
Reading on, she says, second, we need to pin down and cap Second Sight's costs. Third, we need a proper process of appointing the independent chair of the working party. And then she says, finally, I've asked Susan to keep the board fully informed of future developments and to alert me to anything which she is unable to resolve, which could get in the way of getting the job done in the way it needs to be done. She will be seeking conversations about all this with all the non-executive directors on an individual basis, and we'll be in touch with you to arrange these. Moving on, please, to poll 406590. This is the updated version of the report that was circulated to the board.
Sorry, is this, just to clarify, is this the one that you're saying that Martin Edwards sent us?
Exactly.
Okay.
Absolutely. So Martin Edwards sent an email on Saturday, the 27th of July, that said, apologies all, it should have been this version of the note.
Okay.
And this is the updated version of that note. And if we could turn, please, to paragraph 30 and 31. This is the insurance section. It's page 8. Thank you very much. So we see there a changed form of words. It's an expanded form of words at paragraph 31, addressing the insurance position. And it says, the board requested further clarification on their exposure as directors in relation to the review. As set out in more detail at Annex A, it is highly unlikely that any individual director would have any personal liability in connection with this review. And then it refers to insurance being in place to cover their liabilities, and it gives the amount. And then at paragraph 32, in response to the board's request for a post-mortem, internal audit has now been tasked with carrying out a review, etc. So there's just a slight addition on paragraph 31 to what was previously in paragraph 30. And if we scroll down, we can see Annex A. It sets out there the director's duties. The focus being very much on individual liability of directors. Could we please now turn to Poll 00193010, which is another exchange from Alistair Marnock at the bottom of the first page. Thank you. If we scroll down slightly, he says, I'm afraid the para on insurance does not answer the question, which was about PI cover for the post office, not D&O cover for the directors. The key question is, does the post office have insurance cover in the event of a material claim or perhaps a class action type claim? Probably easiest if I pick it up directly with Chris. Irrespective of this particular email chain and whether you focused on this particular issue at this time or not, looking at it, is that a big issue for the post office, whether it has insurance cover in the event of, for example, a class action claim?
My recollection of the 16th of July board meeting was we wanted to make sure we were prudent in taking all the steps we thought needed to be taken in light of our understanding at that time of what the second site interim report was saying. So there was a whole raft of things. I took some personal comfort from the fact Alistair Marnock, as chair of ARC, and who I found to be a very diligent individual, was going to take the lead on behalf of the non-executive directors, I think in his capacity as Audit and Risk Committee chair, for kind of leading some of these areas of work. This issue and all the to and fro you've just shown me on insurance, some of which I wasn't copied on, I don't remember that being high in my list of worry areas. I wonder if it's simply that Alistair Marnock, being diligent, wanted to make sure if the risk profile of this set of issues, particularly, I think we were worrying then about disclosure and some of the things that had been in Susan Crichton's paper of the 12th of July, he may simply have felt they needed to be notified. But I don't remember particularly focusing on this issue, I'm afraid.
We saw this morning the references to, for example, the Shoosmiths case and potentially 85 claimants. We're now at a stage where we have the second site interim report, potential class actions on the horizon. The notification to the insurers was presumably quite an important issue for non-executive directors as a whole, wasn't it?
All I'm saying is I personally don't particularly remember that being high on my list. Alistair perhaps had experience of some other business where they'd needed to notify the insurers. I also don't remember particularly focusing on material claims. I think I was more focused on what are the steps we are taking around what became the mediation scheme, trying to improve the business processes, because that was the single biggest kind of issue I had in front of mind, that if there were problems with helplines or the way the kind of interface with the system worked, that was a big issue. And, of course, getting a more clear view of what the actual situation was.
If we scroll up, we can see a response from Chris Day internally to Charles Colquhoun. He says, Charles, please see if there's a straightforward paragraph we can write on this, should go in my name, rather than giving them the whole insurance paper. If we scroll up, there's again an internal discussion about this. And Charles Colquhoun says, Chris, I don't think Alistair saw the insurance paper, and maybe the 2 points below, and in particular the second covers his point. I'll be in first thing tomorrow to discuss. And again, addressing directors' and officers' liability, and then secondly, professional indemnity, which refers to the limit of indemnity. This covers a breach of professional duty by post office, resulting in a third-party loss, etc. Could we please turn now to poll 00428835. There was reference before in one of the emails chains we saw to Susan Crichton following up with all non-executive directors at this time personally. And it is at this document, so it's poll 00428835. We're now at the 7th of August, and she is contacting you directly. If we scroll down, we can see that's in response to the email that was in this chain, the Alice Perkins email. And if we scroll up, we can see she says, Susannah, I hope you're having a good break. Please let me know if you would like to have a discussion as per Alice's email, and I will organise a time to meet/talk. Did you speak to Susan Crichton at this point in time?
No, I don't think I did, because I've now seen an email or note later in September, I think, where Susan Crichton says she had spoken or exchanged emails with the other Neds and not me. So from that record, I'm inferring that I didn't. I don't know if when we see here it's saying, I hope you're having a good break, it is likely that at that time I was perhaps on a holiday from work, I don't know. But I drew real comfort from the fact Alistair Marnock was taking an active role in this work as set out in the 16th of July.
You were also at this time a non-executive director of the Post Office. Looking at it now, do you think that's an email that you should have followed up on?
I don't know if we know that I didn't follow up. I know, based on the information I've seen, that I didn't meet her. So I don't know if it was a logistical thing, and by the time she was updating in the autumn, it hadn't happened. Of course, I think now, when you look at it, it would have been good to speak to her, not least because I now know all the things you've said about her not being in the room and so on. But at the time, I felt there was a clear set of actions. The non-executive director, Alistair, was taking a lead. So I'm not sure in my shoes at the time I did feel strongly. And obviously, if I had, I would have done something different.
We have seen all of those emails from Alistair Marnock about the insurance position and the lack of clarity on the issue that he is chasing down. Did you have any discussion with Susan Crichton or anybody else at this time about the notification to the Post Office's insurers?
No, not about the insurers. As I say, I'm pretty sure it wasn't me who raised it at the 16th of July. I also wasn't the person charged with following up. So I would have seen some of these emails coming in, and the next opportunity to discuss any of the actions from the 16th of July board meeting would have been at the September board meeting as a group.
Let's have a quick look at the insurance notification itself. That's at poll 00112856. This is an email that we've seen a few times before. Please find attached details received of a new D&O matter for your consideration. The notice concerns challenges which have been made to the accounting system used in the post office network. It says about halfway down that covering email, a review of the Horizon system was undertaken, and whilst recommendations were made for improvements, no systemic problems were revealed, which would call into question the charges previously made against sub-postmasters. It is of concern to Post Office that the expert of one prosecution witness, Dr. Gareth Jenkins of Fujitsu, may have failed to disclose certain problems in the Horizon system potentially relevant to a case. In the event it is discovered that improper prosecution was undertaken, the risk exists of a claim being made against the Post Office and directors and officers for malicious prosecution, etc. It's unclear at this time the extent of possible exposure. A copy of your slip is attached. And if we go over the page, we can see the note that was prepared by Bond Dickinson, and we've addressed this with witnesses from Bond Dickinson. It's over the page, please. There's a section on prosecutions and convictions. And again, in similar words, in relation to Mr. Jenkins, it says, as noted above, where circumstances warrant, Post Office prosecutes, so postmasters, Post Office is reviewing prosecutions. Post Office has an obligation to consider whether further disclosure should be made to defendants. It is of concern that Post Office, that the expert evidence of one prosecution witness, Dr. Gareth Jenkins of Fujitsu, may have failed to disclose certain problems in the Horizon system potentially relevant to a case. What were you aware of in respect of Gareth Jenkins at this time?
I wasn't aware, I don't recall being aware of Gareth Jenkins until a long, long time later.
Looking at this now, does this look to you to be a fair and accurate notification of the position?
I thought you showed on the emails earlier Alistair saying that there'd been a misunderstanding with Chris about whether it was DNO or which insurance. It feels as if somewhere underneath in the business, some people are instructing Bond Dickinson to write a note. They're obviously making some assertions. None of this, I think, came to us, and it wasn't something that we knew at the time. And I think you also showed an email where Chris Day is saying, don't send the board the whole note, just do a paragraph.
And is this note, or is the information contained in this note the kind of information that you would expect to have been shared at board level?
I can't really comment on this note per se because I've only seen it for the first time a few days ago. I think the point I was trying to make before about not being blindsided, giving us early warning of risks, and all of the areas that we discussed and are minuted in the 16th of July board meeting, to my mind, were the strongest signal we as a group of non-executive directors could have sent at that time, that this was now, we understood, to be a much more complicated issue, having received the Second Sight interim report. We wanted to see a series of actions, and we wanted to be aware of what was going on. So, of course, now that I see all of this other information that we didn't see, I can't understand why that wasn't shared with the board, having given such a strong signal at that time on this specific issue. This was not a general signal. This was specifically about all of the things that flowed from the Second Sight interim report.
A concern that an expert witness had given unreliable evidence, whether it was in a case or many cases, would you have expected that to have been brought to your attention?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I was saying, that there was a lot of new news, certainly to me, and I think to the other non-executive directors at that 16th of July board meeting. After that, if there's any material risk, issue, concern, worry, in my experience of boards, when you're in a difficult phase, that's when you want and expect people to be at their most open.
And in your view, why did that information not reach you, looking at what you know now?
I don't know.
Can we have a look at the October board meeting? That's at poll 00158-089. Thank you. It has you down as being present, but only for items 1397 to 1399. If we scroll down, we can see 1397 is the introduction. You then have a section on government funding and the strategic plan. Over the page, please. The role of the board, if we scroll down, and relationship with ShEx, post-funding. It says there, the board noted that Will Gibson would soon be leaving ShEx, and the chairman agreed to discuss his replacement and the ShEx representative on the board with Mark Russell, chief executive ShEx. And then it says Susannah Storey left the meeting. Can you recall why you were only present for those first few items at that particular meeting.
Yeah, this is the issue that I mentioned in my witness statement, that in the autumn of 2013, the then government decided it wanted to take £50 off everybody's energy bill in the country, and the people tasked by the Cabinet Secretary to do that, lead that work, was my job share partner and I. So just at this precise time, it was very intense kind of conflict of roles, which meant I had to leave that meeting early.
We see there at B, it's also a period of transition within ShEx itself. Is that right?
My recollection is that Will Gibson was taking paternity leave, and so would be leaving the shareholder executive team.
So there are changes taking place within the shareholder executive team. You yourself, I think you've described it as an exceptionally busy period of your career outside of post office work. Is that right?
That was an exceptionally busy period in that role. I've had many busy periods in my career.
If we scroll down, we can see that if we go over the page and over to another page, if we keep on scrolling down over to the next page, we have the Chief Executive's report, and then we have at F, a section on Project Sparrow. Sir Anthony Hooper has now been appointed as chairman of the Horizon Working Group. The business is working to prepare the team of people to work on the mediation and case information necessary, as there were likely to be up to 150 cases put to the working party for a decision on whether they progress to the mediation process. You weren't present at the board during that discussion of Project Sparrow, is that right?
Yeah, the minutes will be correct in terms of the chronology of when I left. I obviously would have read the papers, including the Chief Executive's update and including this update.
But there was no government representative on the board whilst this item was being discussed.
Well, I was on the board. I wasn't at the board at this point. I think this is the meeting as well in October 2013 that Mark Russell, who is the Director General by then of the Shareholder Executive, I think he came, but the written information doesn't help me now work out which bits he came for.
I think if we turn to the second page, there's a mention of Mark Russell in relation to the changes that are taking place. If we scroll down, it's at B, there's a reference to Mark Russell. But I don't think he's actually mentioned on the first page as being present or in attendance. So you can't say whether he was there for the discussion of Project Sparrow.
I can't.
But what we can be sure of is that there was no non-executive director who was representing the government's interests on that board during that discussion at the board.
That's right.
And if we turn to poll 3027136, we see there, this is the Chief Executive's report. And if we turn to page 5, we can see there's the section on Project Sparrow that's then discussed at that board meeting. Isn't this exactly the period of time when it was important to have a ShEx representative sitting at the board and discussing Project Sparrow with the board?
I mean, I think the reason why we put a shareholder representative on the board after separation was because we felt all the issues that the Post Office were dealing with were difficult and important, and therefore we generally wanted to increase visibility. Of course, I take your point at this point and at every board after the 16th of July there was a discussion about the issues that became known as Project Sparrow. Would it have been better if I was there? Yes. Did I have an irreconcilable conflict on that day? Yes. Was this part of the reason why I concluded I simply couldn't keep doing this role in the way that I wanted to? Yes. And that is why, at this point, I started my conversations with the shareholder executive to say that I wanted to resign a year early.
Was there any discussion prior to that point, when things started to become particularly busy in your other role, as to somebody to replace you or step in for you?
I've been clear that my other role was a job share. So I was working 3 days a week and my job share partner was working 3 days a week. So in every week, there would be 2 days where I wasn't working in the office, doing meetings for that employer. And therefore, generally in that year, I felt I could give sufficient time to the post office. And in a way, the sort of variable of whether or not things happened was my time, so I would do the work as needed. But I had a sort of growing feeling through this autumn that this was continuing to be a very complicated board with a lot of difficult issues, not only this one, because in another swim lane, as it were, we were just about to announce the new funding, which was the thing we've been working on to make this business sustainable for the last year and a half. That was announced, I think, in November 2013. So there was a lot going on, and that's why I started my conversations with the shareholder executive.
And to summarise where we're at, busy board dealing not just with Sparrow issues and Horizon issues, but other issues. You personally had lots going on in your other role. We've also discussed that you weren't physically present at ShEx anymore, not part of ShEx anymore. Is that a combination of factors that caused real issues?
I have said in my witness statement that I thought the model that was adopted after I left was better. That there were structural obstacles, as we've discussed, in relation to information sharing. I think over time, I felt that I was simply getting more distant from the government, and that I found that personally difficult. I haven't had any period of my career as a civil servant when I've seen ministers less on an issue than I did at this time. As I've said in my statement, I only saw Jo Swinson once in February 2013. So, yes, I didn't think it was completely satisfactory. Was it still better having me than no one? Yes, I'm sure it was, but, we could debate counterfactuals.
So that might be an appropriate moment to take our lunch break.
All right. And what time shall we resume?
We can come back at 2 o'clock.
2 o'clock, fine.